Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. I'm coming to you live from the basement. I'm probably going to try to spruce this place up a little bit. I did find my camera and my microphone, which is a very good thing. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of progressivism, specifically in terms of the world that we're building. The sort of social control system that we have developing that's surveillance-based, technocratic, therapeutic managerialism, like this sort of apparatus of social control that we have. This will relate to some of what I would want to talk about with respect to the history of the ESG stuff that I mentioned in my previous video, but not exactly. But so, for example, I would like to start with, I feel like he's way underestimated. People really need to know more about him and understand him and his influence more. Jeremy Bentham. That's who I want to start with. He is an English, British social reformer. I would call him a progressive, although he's before the progressive movement. He's an influence on positivism. He's the father of utilitarianism. He's an Enlightenment liberal figure. He's important philosophically. Like, the way most people understand him is what little they are familiar with him. It's as the father of utilitarianism. That's great, but I think he really needs to be grappled with a lot more than that, and his influence has been really enormous. He has a hand in the creation of the welfare state, the development of the welfare state. If you're familiar with Foucault, you know this idea of the Panopticon. The idea of the Panopticon actually comes from Jeremy Bentham. For Foucault, the Panopticon is like a symbol of modern totalitarian oppressive regimes. For Jeremy Bentham, it's a utopian ideal about how we should do criminal justice, and his rationale for that is utilitarian. For Jeremy Bentham, he thinks that you can and should actually calculate, you should quantify and calculate what the effects of different policies are going to be in terms of its contribution to, the sum of human happiness, right? So his idea of the panopticon is something like, the more I have to work and be taxed, the more unhappy I'm going to be, right? So that goes into the calculator. The longer prisoners have to be in prison, the more unhappiness is going to be generated, the less happiness. That goes into the calculator, right? The more we have to hurt them, whip them, beat them, whatever, that creates more unhappiness. That goes into the calculator. He's influential in the development of criminal justice because he thinks along these lines that criminal justice should be rehabilitative. We should use sort of the least amount of force possible in order to accomplish the rehabilitation of the criminal. So the panopticon in that sense is sort of perfect because the panopticon, if you recall, there's a kind of central tower. There's a light on top of the central tower. All around it in a circle are the caves that the individual prisoners are in, the cages that the individual prisoners are in, their prison cells. And so the central guard tower is invisible to them. They can't see if anyone's in the guard tower because the light's right above it. But the light illuminates all of the cells, so anyone who's in the central tower can see into all the cells, right? The idea being, ultimately, you don't even really need to have anyone in the central tower in order to rehabilitate the criminals. You put them in there, they don't know if someone's there or not, so there's a constant threat of surveillance. And so because of that, they modify their behavior. They don't, they don't try to break out, whatever, because they think at any time they could be watched. So for Jeremy Bentham, according to his utilitarian calculus, this is good, right? The panopticon is good. What Foucault describes, I think rightly, as being a kind of horror show, for Jeremy Bentham is a positive thing. And actually, I think that the comparison between the two of them, or contrasting of the two of these figures, is more important than that. Because, in a broader sense, the panopticon is a symbol of disciplinarity for Foucault. He thinks that, we moved into disciplinary society. The panopticon is sort of spiritually the structure or the essence of all of our different institutions. That they all have this kind of panoptic function, right? So he thinks the panopticon, although as a prison it was never built, is generalized and diffused into our social institutions. And for Foucault, that's bad. And all of these institutions and the sort of knowledge discourses that relate to them, criminology, psychology, medical science, etc., sociology, all of these things, those discourses, the people who produce those knowledge discourses and who turn them into policy, for Foucault, are the bad guys, right? And those are the sort of technocratic managerial specialists. They're the scientists, the social scientists, and they're the kind of social engineers. And there's a kind of continuum of those things, which is part of why I think it is appropriate that the right wingers read Foucault, understand Foucault, because I think he has the right target. He understands what the problem is. It's just that he doesn't understand that that there is a convergence of sort of left-wing ideology and this kind of technocratic managerialism, and that's what it's about. I think Jeremy Bentham shows that, right? We already have in Jeremy Bentham, in this figure who I'm arguing is extremely important, influential in criminal justice, in the creation of the welfare state, and I think in terms of his influence on positivism, and his influence, I think, is enormous in terms of thinking that we can and should be in the business of calculating human behavior and trying to control behavior in a kind of quantitative way in terms of things like our policy, right? That idea is tremendously important, right? And I think that basically that idea comes from Jeremy Bentham. And he's a bad guy, right? And he's, I think, a kind of archetypal figure of the Enlightenment, an archetypal sort of liberal, an archetypal expression of I would say, progressivism, right? And I think that he has a lot to do with our transition into a kind of disciplinary society. And, in recent years, this has been sort of expanded. Now, you could talk about things like the post-scriptus societies of control, Deleuze and Guattari. The idea there basically being disciplinarity has gone into sort of overdrive. Now we don't have these sort of localized institutions of the school, the clinic, the barracks, the factory, etc., in which disciplinary pressure is exerted on individuals in order to control their behavior. It's been diffused and digitized, right? But it's been diffused throughout society. It's non-local. And so the disciplinary pressure is being exerted on us all the time. This threat of surveillance is being exerted on us all the time, right? Your ISP can and does report your behavior on the internet to local law enforcement or the CIA or FBI or corporations. They might sell your data to corporations. Social media companies are selling your data to corporations, your private information. When you're just at home talking to your wife and you have an Alexa there, Alexa is recording your conversations, right? And merging it with a kind of giant data set of all of the conversations of everybody who is recorded by these things. But so, you don't you don't have an interval. There's no I'm at the factory being besieged by disciplinary power. Now I leave, I clock out, then I go home and I'm free. Then I wake up in the morning, maybe I go to school or something like that. I go and I clock in. Now disciplinary power is being exerted on me. We don't have that anymore. When you're at home, when you're at work, if you work from home, it doesn't matter. All of these boundaries have dissolved, right? I think of this in terms of the kind of society of control or surveillance society that somebody like Deleuze and Guattari is talking about. It's basically the liquid modernity version of disciplinary society. All the boundaries have been dissolved. The solid structures in terms of the institutions have been dissolved. And so you're just floating forever in this sort of ocean of surveillance, right? And you don't know where you are, and you don't know if you're coming and going, you don't know. sometimes if you're like working, whether you're working or not, and even if you're not working, you're often like generating revenue for people because of your consumption of ads. You're generating information that goes into corporate, corporate sort of strategy meetings or whatever. Your data is being compiled and used. You're doing this, you're doing that. There are campaigns to sort of to garner your attention. We move to like an attention economy. So you're constantly participating in economic activity, whether you're at home or at work or on the train or commuting or whatever the hell you're doing, right? And so we move in this direction of sort of less and less overt coercive pressure being exerted on individuals to control their behavior, but that control becomes more and more pervasive, right? More invisible and more pervasive. And so I would argue and agree with somebody like Foucault or Deleuze and Guattari that this is worse, right? That it's more oppressive. Panoptic society is more oppressive. Like Foucault's idea is all these institutions basically function like panopticons. And then when we move into the liquid modernity version of that, it's just the society as a whole. Every moment of your life, you're always already sort of involved in this, in the panopticon. You're always in your cell, right? There's never any escape from the cell at all. And obviously, if you want to think about this in terms of Jeremy Bentham, this is vastly more effective. It's way more cost effective, right? You get to do this. You get to control human behavior, the behavior of everyone, all the time, everywhere, with a minimal amount of effort, with a very minimal amount of expenditure, right? It's extremely efficient. It's a kind of brilliant system that's just evil. It's just evil. Let me see what else I wanted to say about this. There's no difference between public and private. There's no central authority. That's a big problem too, because nobody knows where to address their ire, right? Or their resentment or their anger. And so I think that creates a lot of, fighting between various just people, just low-level people, We're like, they're the problem, they're the problem, they're the problem, you're the problem, whatever. There's no central authority. There's no particular figure. There's no particular political party which is responsible for our being enmeshed in this kind of infinite surveillance net, And there's no private and public anymore, which I think transforms radically sort of the nature of human beings. Like, there's no public world that then you retreat out from into your private world where you can have your private thoughts, you can have private conversations, private relationships. All of these things are increasingly mediated, controlled, engineered, right? And even when they're not that, they're being monitored, right? They become part of this data collection process. They become part of a kind of new strategy for reaching people and controlling behavior. And it doesn't have to be this kind of dark evil, like we want to control all the people and make them do what we want or something like. I mean, I think that's maybe an element, frankly. But it's just, it's a corporate strategy. Like, if you're trying to capture more of the market is about attention. What do you want to do? You want to figure out ways to garner more attention from people. How do I get more of their attention? How do I know what they want? How do I give them what they want more and more? How do I make them want what I have? Right? This is just business. It doesn't have to be this kind of evil Machiavellian thing, although I think that it in part is. The other thing I wanted to talk about that, so we have this like Jeremy Bentham thing. I think you can see a kind of evolution of that when you get to somebody like Woodrow Wilson, right? And Woodrow Wilson was the student of, I think his name was Robert E. Lee, and he was a enormously influential person in the field of public administration. And basically he had this theory, which was positivistic, which is Benthamite, right? Which is that things are becoming increasingly complex. Technologies are increasingly complex. the decisions that need to be made are increasingly complex and large, affecting a large enough area or number of people or whatever, that it no longer makes sense to have these decisions have something to do with the public decision-making process, with deliberative democracy. That's too slow. The people who would be contributing to that decision are too uninformed. You need experts, you need technocrats, you need managers, you need people to make these decisions who are unbiased, who are unaffected by, sort of their own stupid private political opinions or something like that. And so with Wood, you see that, like, right, this is the kind of revolution in public administration. Woodrow Wilson is a disciple of this way of thinking. And of course, when he gets into the White House, what does he do? He massively expands the public bureaucracy. The modern sort of public administration, we sort of have Woodrow Wilson to thank for this. And that's obviously the idea, right? You proliferate all of these different agencies, all of these different bureaus in the executive branch, things like the EPA or the National Forestry Service or the National Weather Service, whatever. On and on and on and on forever. There are a billion of these things. The idea behind that is this idea from public administration, right? That decisions are literally just being taken away from the democratic process because we're too stupid and bigoted or whatever to make those decisions, right? Obviously, this then gets combined with stuff like we see in like denazification. This is sort of a different story, but that's why you wind up getting things like tests for authoritarian personality and stuff like that being implemented in the California public employment system and blah, 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 blah. So this story sort of goes along with that too. But the point here is basically just like Woodrow Wilson, a major figure of the sort of American progressive movement. He's terrible in a lot of ways. One of the ways that he's terrible is that he basically created the deep state. It's changed in a lot of ways since him, but he created the deep state. He did it with this idea of public administration, which I think can pretty easily be traced back to Bentham, and which is this kind of like, we're going to take over the responsibility of social control, the management of public perceptions, and policy. We're going to take it out of the hands of ordinary people, of the voting public, because we know better, we're the experts, etc. Right? That's obviously an attitude that sort of has continued, right? It's this is a problem that's been exacerbated. Interestingly, there's a kind of anti-positivist movement within the field of public administration that occurs later. And this is where it starts to connect to things like ESG and the development that happens later, this kind of anti-positivist movement. What they say, and I think that they're basically right about this, but it should have entailed going back to the democratic process probably. But they say, actually, it's impossible to be neutral and objective and scientific. Everyone is coming to the table with biases. We can't set those things aside. The fact-value distinction is bullshit. And so what we need to do is understand and utilize our ideological bent, which, since we're the experts and the technocratic social engineer managers, obviously we have the good ideas. We have the good ideology. We participate in the ideology of managerialism, which, if you want to understand that sort of thing, reading somebody like Burnham or Alvin Goldner, right? The Marxist Alvin Goldner, and his book, what is it called? Just On the Intellectuals or something like that. Alvin Goldner's great. That's a great book. You can read those things in order to understand managerial ideology. I don't know if I want to go into it right now, but yeah, that becomes the kind of governing. Oh wait, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so that's how it becomes filled with these kind of activists. So now we have these technocratic managerial experts who are governing our lives, who are making all the decisions about how we should live and what we should do, and they're doing it on the basis of a specifically kind of activistic agenda, right? And this has seeped also into the private sphere, right? It's become a kind of private sphere project as well. And again, you can sort of understand this thing. Like if you think about behavioral economics, which this stuff is related to, things like that. This idea of capturing attention, really understanding people's biases, public perceptions, the management of public perceptions. Obviously, corporations have an interest in that too, right? So different ideas from this kind of public administration developments, I think they have tended to and they have seeped into the private sphere. Then you get things like corporate social responsibility, you get things like ESG. But yeah, the general idea is like, yeah, we can, especially when you're dealing with like the law of large numbers, right? This is sort of what nudge theory is about. And when you're dealing with a huge population, if you do something that affects a tiny proportion of them, right? This goes back to the efficiency stuff with Jeremy Bentham. You can do a tiny thing, have a kind of tiny difference that is introduced. Maybe you modify a search engine result or something like that. And as a consequence of that, you actually affect the perception, the thought, the behavior of a huge number of people, right? You could affect, let's say, the outcome of an election, and all you have to do is make very small changes, nudges to your social media algorithm or to your search engine results or to ChatGPT or something like that, and although it's tiny, it's invisible, it's super efficient, right? Even if out of 100 people, only one of them is affected at all by it, the final tally of effect is enormous because an enormous amount of people are using social media, right? And even the people who aren't using social media, they get their information from people who are, so they're plugged in by proxy. Right? And I think that's increasingly the way that that all of this sort of works, right? And it's interesting to me because I've always been kind of like, in terms of thinking about the elaboration of this kind of way of thinking, and if you think about things like the OSS, specifically stuff like I was talking about with the denazification type stuff, then they turn into the CIA, and then you get all these different programs, right? We know about programs in which they were trying to figure out how to do mind control, right? Operations Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra, right? Those are kind of good examples of that. We know they've had operations like Operation Mockingbird, in which they're trying to get involved with the media and control media narratives, etc. Again, in the interest of social control and the management of public perception. So we know that there's this history. Then you get things like the development of nudge units in the government, right? So you get one explicitly in 2010 in the United Kingdom. Theirs was called BIT. What did it stand for again? The Behavioral Insights Team, right? They had this manifesto they put out called Mindspace. And again, they're talking specifically about like, how can we affect an enormous change in the behavior of the body politic in terms of their perceptions, in terms of their understanding, their way of thinking? How can we mold the mind and mold human behavior with a minimum output of effort and cost, right? And so that's what this nudge theory about. So the government is like, okay, what are we going to do? We want to create a new British citizen who has these enlightened values, who's a good person in terms of my conception of that. And I know, because I'm the expert, I participate and I create the knowledge discourse, right? I'm responsible for I don't know, it's the psychological discourse about morality, and about the morality of ideologies or something like that. So I'm the expert. That's why I'm in this position, this unelected position in the deep state. I'm a manager of the ideas of the public. That's what my role is. So obviously I'm the expert on that. And so how can I make you be more like a kind of ideal British citizen from my perspective? By doing things like, putting some stickers up somewhere, or changing the structure of a bench, or blah, 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 right? Imperceptibly. How do I exert this control imperceptibly with the minimum output of effort? You get it in the United States too. We got a team like that evolved, again, explicitly. I think these things were going on implicitly or covertly for a long time in things like CIA operations. I'm sure they still are. I'm sure they've continued. I'm sure after MK Ultra they didn't go, well, okay, we don't care about mind control anymore. That was an interesting foray into an era, into a gray area that we just would rather not explore anymore. That doesn't seem reasonable to me. But we get them explicitly in the United States in the Obama era. And I think this is interesting again because I feel like phenomenologically, I feel like there has been a concentrated effort and operation of psychological information terror being waged on me and being waged on the American public at large for, I don't know, about since 2014 when this unit was developed. I think it's called the SBST, the Social and Behavioral Sciences Team or something like that. And they're doing this kind of psychological research. They're doing behavioral economics. All right, they're thinking about all these things. They're trying to use nudge theory to produce a new kind of American citizen, which, I mean, to exert social control, to achieve desired ends in the management and production of the human soul, of the psyche, right? That is their goal. And of course, like you would talk about with ESG or something, this is a global effort. The SBST and the BIT work together constantly, right? There's a partnership between the nudge unit in Britain and the nudge unit in the United States. The same thing we're seeing emerge in terms of disinformation, like the disinformation industry. The names are sort of slipping my mind right now, but there have been a number of kind of NGO-like bodies and organizations of powerful people and things affiliated with various governments internationally and stuff like that that are exclusively devoted to disinformation. They say combating disinformation, but essentially what they're doing is producing disinformation. That'll be an episode for a future time, I guess, something like that. But yeah, this is a global operation, and when you're doing something like that, again, it's a kind of total subversion of the democratic process. If the deep state, the permanent Washington is undergoing all constant operations to control behavior and control the mind and control your thoughts and feelings and perceptions and opinions, right? And those people are unaccountable. You don't know who they are. They're doing all this stuff behind the scenes. These aren't things that are voted on, and it's global. It's a global operation. When that's going on, even insofar as a kind of nominal democracy based on individual voter rights exists, it's nominal. There's a de facto control over policy, over information, over everything that is totally outside of the realm of the control of the body politic, the control of citizens, right? And that's the reality of the world that we live in. It sounds conspiratorial. I've always kind of not liked things that sound conspiratorial, but it's beyond doubt. It's just reality to some degree. But I feel like this has a lot to do with anarcho-tyranny too, by the way. The idea of like focused deterrence, right? So behind the scenes, and I'll do a video on anarcho-tyranny eventually probably too, but behind the scenes I think that a lot of decisions are being made like in this Bentham orientation that are like, if we could scale back and only intervene, like do a police intervention or something in like this small subset of cases and still have 80% deterrence as opposed to 85 if we quadruple the expenditures or quadruple the police presence or something like that. And so they scale back. And so it turns out that maybe you have populations that are a little easier to control than other populations, right? And so you can minimize effort and still exert a tremendous amount of social control on one population. And maybe another population is small enough, or the effect on them, doing something to them affects the others more, or something like that. And so you're like, okay, well, a certain class of people we're going to allow to jump the turnstiles, or we're going to allow to, drive around in New York City on motorcycles and dirt bikes and stuff like that on the streets without any kind of license or anything. We're not going to stop them, right? We're going to allow people to speed. And then they're getting us in a car chase. Our calculation is that pursuing them in the chase is more costly, produces more human unhappiness, right? We're going to wind up hurting civilians or something like that. The costs are too high. We're just going to let them go. Whereas the person on the highway, in his minivan with his family of four or whatever, he's speeding 10 miles an hour on the highway or something, and we're going to stop him and give him a big fine, right? Because it's been calculated that if you focus deterrence on a particular population, you only do it in a specific small number of cases and times, something like that, then you can sort of maximize your results. Like it's a kind of like from games, you could call this min-maxing or something like that. I do think a lot of the conspiratorial stuff in terms of what they're thinking and why they're doing it and who they are or whatever, I think a lot of that stuff is wrong or misguided or stupid or whatever. I don't really care personally. You can be as wrong or misguided or stupid as you want. That doesn't bother me. But I think that stuff tends to be sort of wrong. And that a lot of it, like, you don't need dark, evil motives about world domination. Although maybe that does exist in some cases. You look at people like, what's that guy's name? Man, it shouldn't be slipping my mind, but it is. The, like, dark lord of the Davos group, right? I forget his name, but he's the one that wrote the Great Reset. Anyway, you look at a guy like that and you're like, okay, maybe there is some kind of dark agenda about dominating humanity or something like that, but in general you don't need that. Like, it's just the dominance of this idea of human beings and societies that I think goes back to somebody like Bentham, that I think is part and parcel with the Enlightenment and liberalism. Just this idea of technocratic managerial control, right? The idea that everything is quantifiable, a kind of cost benefit analysis frame of reference and mentality, right? I think that there are these kind of underlying social, psychological, or ideological components that are more important and that are not, where you don't need to get bogged down into like individual, like personal evil motives or something like that, right? There are sort of structural dynamics at work that are more important to understand. But anyway, that's it for now. I'm going to have, I think, the next Sloterdijk video up pretty soon. This went longer than I expected it to. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, don't simply react, but think culture.